the story of behavioral economics begins not in the bustling laboratories of the late 20th century, but much earlier in the quiet study of an 18th century philosopher and economist. Adam Smith, remembered by most as the father of classical economics, also wrote extensively about the quirks and contradictions of human nature. In his 1759 work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith observed that people are not always guided by perfect logic or cold calculation. He noted, among other things, the tendency for individuals to be overconfident and the pain they feel from losses, a phenomenon now known as loss aversion. These early insights, though couched in the language of philosophy and moral inquiry, foreshadowed the challenges that would later confront the rigid formalism of economic theory. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, economics sought to establish itself as a precise science, borrowing the tools and methods of mathematics to create models of human behavior. The dominant framework, known as neoclassical economics, rested on a set of powerful assumptions. According to these models, people are rational actors. They have stable, consistent preferences, access to perfect information, and the ability to weigh costs and benefits with clinical precision. When faced with choices, they maximize their utility, always selecting the option that brings the greatest satisfaction. This rational actor model became both the normative ideal, how people ought to behave, and, for many, the descriptive reality of how they actually do behave. Yet as these mathematical models grew more sophisticated, cracks began to appear. Critics pointed out that the rational actor framework often failed to account for real-world behavior. People procrastinate, make impulsive purchases, and stubbornly stick to failing investments. Pioneering thinkers such as Maurice Allais and Daniel Ellsberg highlighted anomalies, paradoxes that could not be explained by standard economic theory. Their work, along with that of Harry Markowitz, laid the groundwork for a new wave of inquiry. In the second half of the 20th century, the systematic integration of psychology into economics began to gather momentum. Advances in cognitive psychology were revealing the limits of human reasoning, suggesting that economic decision-making could not be understood without considering mental shortcuts, biases, and emotional responses. Some scholars have argued that behavioral economics might more accurately be described as cognitive economics, given its deep roots in the study of how people think, perceive, and judge. The real breakthrough came in the 1970s and 1980s, when behavioral economics crystallized as a distinct field. At the heart of this transformation were two remarkable psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their collaboration drew on the traditions of behavioralism and Gestalt psychology, but it was their commitment to empirical, replicable experiments that set their work apart. Rather than theorizing in the abstract, Kahneman and Tversky designed simple, elegant studies to probe the ways people actually make choices. Their approach emphasized observable behavioral patterns, regularities in how people deviate from the ideal of rationality, rather than relying on hidden, unmeasurable constructs. One of the defining moments in the birth of behavioral economics occurred at the 1969 meetings of the American Psychological Association. There, Kahneman and Tversky presented early findings that would become foundational. Their experiments, and those that followed, revealed systematic deviations from rational choice theory, deviations that were not random or idiosyncratic, but deeply rooted in the architecture of human thought. Consider the endowment effect, one of the many irrationalities uncovered by behavioral economics. When people are given an object, a mug for example, they tend to value it more highly simply because they own it. This attachment to possessions, even newly acquired ones, flies in the face of the rational actor model, which assumes that preferences should not shift based on ownership. Other studies demonstrated the power of regret, the lure of excessive optimism, and the stubborn grip of loss aversion, the tendency to feel the pain of losses more acutely than the pleasure of equivalent gains. These patterns, replicated across diverse settings and populations, suggested that irrationality was not an occasional lapse, but a pervasive feature of human decision-making. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that the neat assumptions of traditional economics were, at best, incomplete. The rational actor model presupposes not only perfect logic, but also perfect information and unlimited cognitive capacity. In reality, people face profound limitations. They make decisions in environments of uncertainty, asymmetrical information, and limited attention. The concept of bounded rationality, introduced by Herbert Simon and later developed further by behavioral economists, captured this idea. Rather than maximizing utility, people satisfice. They look for solutions that are good enough, using rules of thumb and mental shortcuts. The emergence of behavioral economics did not simply add a few psychological quirks to existing models. It fundamentally challenged the core assumptions of economics, questioning whether rationality, self-interest, and perfect information could serve as reliable guides to human behavior. The new field drew on insights from psychology, sociology, and even politics, weaving these threads into richer, more nuanced models. Researchers began to study how the framing of choices, the so-called choice architecture, could influence decisions, and how heuristics, those mental shortcuts, could lead to predictable biases. Richard Thaler, another key figure in behavioral economics, extended these insights into domains ranging from finance to public policy. Thaler and others demonstrated that people are not always the best judges of their own long-term interests. Overconfidence, short-term bias, and inertia can lead individuals to act against their own welfare, whether it is failing to save for retirement, succumbing to unhealthy habits, or making risky investments. These observations did more than expand the reach of economics. They began to reshape the field, prompting questions about how institutions and policymakers might design interventions to help people make better choices. By the late 20th century, behavioral economics had achieved recognition as a distinct subfield. Advances in computing and data analysis allowed researchers to test behavioral theories with increasing rigor, applying them to questions of nutrition, housing, health insurance, and addiction. The field's influence began to spread beyond academia, informing public policy and nudging governments to consider the psychological dimensions of economic behavior. Despite its growing prominence, behavioral economics remains grounded in empirical observation. Its practitioners, following the example of Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler, continue to conduct experiments, sometimes in the laboratory, sometimes in the field, that reveal the complexities of human decision-making. Each study adds to a body of evidence showing that, while people are not perfectly rational, their departures from rationality are systematic, measurable, and, to a surprising degree, predictable. The emergence of behavioral economics marks a profound shift in how economists understand the world. It does not reject the insights of classical or neoclassical theory, but rather enriches them, acknowledging the messiness of real human behavior. In doing so, it offers a more accurate and ultimately more humane portrait of economic life, one that recognizes both our aspirations for rationality and the many ways we fall short. As research continues, the field promises to deepen our understanding of why we make the choices we do and how we might design a world that helps us make better ones. Imagine standing in a grocery store staring at two nearly identical products. Both are on sale, but one sports a bright red sticker announcing, "Now 20% off," while the other quietly lists its reduced price without fanfare. Most of us would gravitate toward the item with the bold discount label, even if the savings are identical. Why does the way information is presented, its frame, so powerfully shape our choices? This question lies at the heart of behavioral economics, a field built on the observation that our minds are prone to systematic errors in judgment, known as cognitive biases. At the core of behavioral economics are a few key concepts that challenge the tidy predictions of standard economic theories. Among these, loss aversion, anchoring, and the framing effect stand out for their pervasiveness and impact. Each highlights a different way our intuitions can lead us astray, often without our awareness, influencing decisions from the mundane to the monumental. Loss aversion, perhaps the most famous of these biases, describes our strong tendency to weigh potential losses much more heavily than equivalent gains. Empirical studies confirm that this bias is robust, shaping economic decisions even at the scale of national economies. For example, the distress of losing $100 typically far outweighs the pleasure of gaining the same amount. This asymmetry helps explain why people are reluctant to part with possessions, why investors may cling to losing stocks, and why risk-averse behavior can be so persistent. The emotional impact of loss aversion is not just a theoretical curiosity. It affects real-world decisions about market participation, portfolio allocation, and even how much people save for the future. Interestingly, loss aversion is not constant across all situations. When making choices on behalf of others, people tend to show less loss aversion than when deciding for themselves. Scholars believe this difference may stem from lower emotional involvement and a diminished sense of personal responsibility when acting as an agent rather than a principal. In addition, loss aversion is closely tied to our expectations. When people's reference points, what they perceive as the status quo shift, the same objective outcome can feel like either a loss or a gain depending on how it is framed. This expectations-based loss aversion can lead to puzzling behavior, such as rejecting beneficial changes simply because they appear to entail a loss relative to a previous expectation. The influence of loss aversion extends into business and public policy. Marketers and strategists routinely exploit our dislike of losses, crafting messages and offers that emphasize what might be missed rather than what might be gained. The psychological and emotional effects of loss aversion inform everything from retirement planning to consumer protection laws. At a deeper level, research shows that loss aversion can help explain certain choices that seem irrational within standard models, offering a more nuanced understanding of why people sometimes select options that defy logic. Another key bias, anchoring, shows just how sticky our first impressions can be. When faced with a decision, people tend to rely heavily on the first piece of information they encounter, the anchor, even if it is arbitrary or irrelevant. Consider a shopper who sees a jacket marked down from $300 to $150. The original price serves as an anchor, making the sale price seem like a bargain regardless of the jacket's actual value. This anchoring effect is not limited to shopping. It influences negotiations, salary discussions, and even judicial sentencing. Studies have shown that simply being exposed to an irrelevant number can sway subsequent estimates and decisions. Anchoring works by providing a reference point from which people make adjustments, but those adjustments are often insufficient. This can skew judgment and prevent objective evaluation. In business, understanding anchoring can be both an opportunity and a risk. It offers ways to influence consumer behavior, but also represents a trap for managers and investors who may become fixated on outdated or misleading benchmarks. In investing, anchoring can cause individuals to cling to initial valuations or price targets even as circumstances change. Closely related to anchoring is the framing effect, which demonstrates that the way information is presented, the frame can alter decisions even when the underlying facts remain unchanged. The framing effect was first described in experiments that presented participants with choices involving gains or losses. When identical outcomes were framed in terms of potential gains, people tended to prefer safe options. When framed in terms of losses, they became more risk-seeking. This shift in risk preference based solely on wording highlights the malleability of our decision-making processes. Framing effects are not limited to abstract experiments. They permeate everyday life. In consumer research, for example, people are more likely to buy meat labeled 75% lean than 25% fat, even though both describe the same product. In public health campaigns, messages that emphasize the benefits of taking action often prompt different responses than those that stress the costs of inaction. The framing effect underscores the idea that perception, not just facts, shapes our choices. Behavioral economics identifies a broader constellation of cognitive biases that systematically lead us away from rational behavior. The default bias and status quo bias, for instance, explain why people are so prone to stick with existing arrangements, even suboptimal ones, rather than make active changes. The affect heuristic shows how emotions can shortcut deliberation, leading to decisions based on feelings rather than careful analysis. Ambiguity aversion highlights our discomfort with uncertainty, causing us to shy away from choices where outcomes are unclear, even if the odds are favorable. Heuristics, mental shortcuts that help us navigate complex decisions, can be both helpful and hazardous. The availability heuristic leads us to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, which can distort risk assessments. Confirmation bias causes us to seek information that supports our existing beliefs, while overconfidence bias leads us to overestimate our abilities or knowledge. In investing, these biases are particularly pronounced, with overconfidence and herd mentality driving poor decisions and speculative bubbles. Studies suggest that only a minority of investors consistently outperform the market, underscoring the persistent influence of cognitive and emotional factors. Cognitive bias is, at its core, an unconscious error in thinking, one that distorts perception, judgment, and decision-making. Overcoming these biases requires more than just intelligence or education. It demands a conscious awareness of their effects and deliberate strategies to counteract them. Despite this, many biases remain deeply ingrained, shaping choices in subtle and persistent ways. The field of behavioral economics has cataloged dozens of these biases, from the endowment effect, the tendency to overvalue what we own, to hindsight bias, which makes outcomes seem more predictable after the fact. Bounded rationality, the idea that people operate within limits of information and computational power, provides an overarching framework for understanding why these errors persist. Rather than viewing human decision-makers as hopelessly irrational, behavioral economics offers a more sympathetic perspective. Our minds rely on shortcuts and rules of thumb because the world is complex and information is often incomplete. Yet, the systematic nature of these biases means that our mistakes are not random. They are predictable. This insight has profound implications for economics, policy, and society. By recognizing where and how our intuitions fail, researchers and practitioners can design interventions, so-called nudges, that help people make better choices. But before such interventions can be crafted, it is essential to understand the foundations, the core concepts, and cognitive biases that guide, and sometimes misguide, our everyday decisions. As we move forward, the challenge is not only to identify these mental pitfalls, but to harness this knowledge in ways that improve individual and collective outcomes. Every day, people navigate a world overflowing with choices, from the ordinary to the life-changing. The human mind, for all its brilliance, is not designed to calculate the perfect answer for every decision. Instead, it relies on mental shortcuts, heuristics, that make life manageable in a complex, uncertain environment. Heuristics are essentially rules of thumb, quick, intuitive guides that simplify decision-making when information is incomplete or time is short. While these shortcuts are often efficient, they can carry hidden costs, quietly steering choices in ways that defy classical ideas of rationality. The concept of bounded rationality lies at the heart of this understanding. Herbert Simon, a pioneer in the field, observed that people rarely optimize their decisions. Instead, they look for solutions that are good enough, given the constraints of their mental resources, the information available, and the ticking clock of daily life. Decision-making, then, is less about exhaustive calculation and more about adaptability in the face of limitation. Simon's insights replace the old ideal of the economic actor as a calculating machine with a more realistic picture, one where rationality is bounded by the very structure of the mind and the environment in which it operates. Heuristics, as later described and expanded by researchers such as Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, illustrate this process in action. These mental shortcuts allow for swift judgments, especially when the stakes are unclear or the data is overwhelming. Take the expertise heuristic, for example. When people encounter conflicting claims online, they often resolve uncertainty by deferring to sources they perceive as credible or authoritative. In the rapid churn of social media, this shortcut reduces cognitive effort, allowing individuals to make quick judgments about whom to trust, even if the underlying reasoning is superficial. The expertise heuristic demonstrates both the usefulness and the potential for bias that come with these mental strategies. Other heuristics, such as the availability heuristic, anchoring, and confirmation bias, reveal how the mind navigates uncertainty. The availability heuristic, for instance, leads people to overestimate the likelihood of events that come readily to mind, like believing plane crashes are common after seeing news coverage of a rare accident. Anchoring sets a reference point, often arbitrary, from which subsequent judgments are made. Confirmation bias steers the search for information toward what already fits with existing beliefs, making it hard to update one's views in light of new evidence. These patterns show that heuristics are double-edged. They enable rapid decisions but can also introduce systematic errors, especially when relied upon uncritically. This raises a question: if heuristics can lead to bias, why does the brain rely on them so heavily? The answer lies in the ecological rationality of these shortcuts. In many real-world situations, perfect information is unavailable and time is short. Heuristics often provide good enough answers that work well under these constraints, even if they occasionally misfire. For example, the expertise heuristic is especially adaptive when decisions must be made quickly, or when the cost of deep analysis outweighs the potential benefit. In this sense, heuristics are not flaws in our mental machinery, but pragmatic solutions tailored to the environments in which people live. Bounded rationality is more than a description of mental limitation. It is a framework that recognizes the richness and variety of human behavior. Simon's model encompasses not just how people actually behave, the descriptive aspect, but also how they might behave under different conditions, the normative and prescriptive aspects. Rather than asking why people fail to meet the impossible standard of perfect rationality, the bounded rationality approach asks how they manage to cope so effectively, given their constraints. This shift in perspective paved the way for a more nuanced understanding of economic and social behavior, one that values adaptability and context as much as logic and calculation. Choice architecture emerges as a powerful extension of these insights. The way choices are presented and organized, the very design of the decision environment can have profound effects on what people choose. Choice architecture is not about limiting freedom, but about recognizing that the arrangement of options, the setting of defaults, and the framing of information all influence behavior. For instance, the order in which options are listed, the use of salient cues, or the establishment of a default choice can nudge people towards certain outcomes without closing off alternatives. Automatic enrollment in retirement plans or green energy programs are real-world examples where defaults take advantage of inertia and status quo bias to promote beneficial behaviors. The structure of choice environments is not neutral. Every menu, web page, or ballot is organized in some way, and these arrangements shape the decisions that follow. Even subtle contextual effects, such as the way products are grouped on a shelf or which attributes are highlighted, can sway consumer preferences, sometimes more than the actual differences between the options themselves. In this sense, context is not just a backdrop to decision-making, it is an active participant, shaping choices in ways that may be invisible to those making them. Consider how framing and salience operate within choice architecture. A government seeking to boost civic participation might design voter registration forms so that the default is to be included, requiring active opt-out rather than opt-in. The salience of certain options, making them stand out visually or conceptually, can guide attention and increase the likelihood of selection. These strategies do not force choices, but they do channel behavior in predictable directions, often with significant real-world consequences. The implications of bounded rationality in choice architecture reach far beyond theory. In fields as diverse as health, finance, and public policy, the recognition that people satisfice rather than optimize has led to practical interventions aimed at improving decision quality. For example, understanding that people are prone to inertia and time pressure has inspired tools that simplify complex decisions, such as pre-selected investment portfolios or streamlined benefit menus for health plans. These interventions do not assume that people will weigh every option with perfect detachment. Instead, they work with human tendencies, shaping environments to make better choices easier, not harder. Yet the use of heuristics and the deliberate design of choice environments raise important questions. If mental shortcuts are both adaptive and potentially misleading, how can individuals and institutions strike a balance between efficiency and accuracy? Can choice architects nudge people toward better outcomes without crossing into manipulation? These questions remain at the forefront of research and debate as scholars continue to explore how the architecture of choice can be harnessed for public good without compromising autonomy. What emerges from this exploration is a portrait of human decision-making that is both fallible and ingenious. Heuristics are not simply errors to be corrected, but essential tools for navigating a world of uncertainty. Bounded rationality acknowledges the impossibility of perfection while celebrating the mind's ability to find workable solutions in complex, messy environments. Choice architecture, in turn, offers a way to support better decisions by respecting the realities of human psychology. Together, these concepts form the foundation of a behavioral economics that is at once pragmatic and humane, grounded in the limits of the mind, yet always seeking ways to expand the horizons of choice. Imagine stepping into a world where your everyday decisions are quietly shaped by invisible hands, sometimes for your benefit, sometimes not. This is the landscape behavioral economics now inhabits, no longer confined to academic journals or laboratory settings, but woven into the fabric of policy, health, finance, and beyond. The shift from theory to practice has been swift and, in many cases, profound. Consider the growing use of behavioral nudges in both public and private sectors. These subtle interventions, such as setting automatic enrollment as the default in retirement savings plans, a strategy expanded by legislative efforts like the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement 2.0 Act, aim to encourage better long-term financial behavior by leveraging human tendencies toward inertia and the path of least resistance. Yet as these nudges proliferate, questions about their broader implications also multiply. Critics warn that, while helpful, such strategies may cross a line into paternalism, subtly undermining personal autonomy by steering choices without explicit consent. Nowhere is the impact of behavioral economics more evident than in public health policy. Governments worldwide have adopted behavioral insights to reshape the environments in which people make decisions about their health. Rather than relying solely on mandates or financial incentives, many initiatives adjust the context in which choices are made. For example, altering cafeteria layouts to make healthier foods more accessible or rewording reminders for vaccinations can gently steer behaviors in healthier directions. These environmental adjustments do not remove choices or impose significant penalties or rewards. Instead, they guide people by making certain actions easier or more noticeable. This approach is grounded in the idea that, when faced with complexity or ambiguity, people often stick with what feels simplest or most immediate. Incorporating behavioral economics into public health has delivered promising results, especially when interventions are carefully designed and rigorously evaluated. Personalized messages tailored to individual characteristics, for instance, can increase the uptake of preventative medical tests or improve adherence to medication regimens. These nudges are not merely academic exercises. They have tangible effects, sometimes at a fraction of the cost of traditional policies. Economists and policymakers have found that these techniques can help address inefficiencies in healthcare systems, encourage better nutrition, and even nudge clinicians toward best practices. Yet the effectiveness of nudges, while often positive, is not uniform. Systematic reviews of interventions aimed at changing physician and patient behaviors reveal a range of outcomes, highlighting that context and execution matter immensely. Beyond health and finance, behavioral economics has also found fertile ground in labor economics and broader public policy. Its influence is visible in workplace programs designed to encourage skill development or safe practices, as well as in government efforts to increase tax compliance or promote voter turnout. The integration of behavioral specialists into policy development, as recommended by the national academies, reflects a recognition that understanding human psychology is essential for crafting interventions that truly work. At the same time, the field is being transformed by new data sources and experimental methods, enabling researchers to test interventions at larger scales and resolve long-standing debates about what works, for whom, and under what circumstances. Despite these advances, the practice of nudging is not without controversy. At the heart of the debate lies a tension between effectiveness and ethics. Nudges are often justified on the grounds that they respect freedom of choice. After all, they do not eliminate options or substantially alter economic incentives. Instead, they change how options are presented, making some paths easier to follow than others. This approach can be remarkably cost-effective, especially compared to traditional regulations or subsidies. Yet, as recent meta-analyses have shown, nudges may not always deliver the dramatic results their proponents hope for, raising legitimate questions about their cost-effectiveness and the wisdom of relying on them for complex social problems. Ethical considerations go deeper than mere effectiveness. Critics worry that nudges, by their very subtlety, risk manipulating people in ways they neither notice nor fully understand. If a government or corporation designs a choice environment to nudge citizens or customers toward a particular outcome whose interests are being served, ethical practice requires a careful evaluation of the goals behind nudging, a steadfast commitment to preserving individual autonomy, and a transparent assessment of the effects, both intended and unintended. Transparency, in particular, is crucial. People should be able to understand how and why their choices are being shaped, and interventions should align with their own interests rather than those of the nudger. It is important to recognize that not all nudges are created equal. The ethical evaluation of any given nudge depends on its content, its goals, and how openly it is implemented. A nudge that helps people avoid costly mistakes, such as reminding them to renew a prescription, may be viewed as benign or even beneficial. In contrast, nudges designed to maximize profits at the expense of consumers or to advance political interests without informed consent raise deeper ethical concerns. The question of who decides what is in a person's best interest is not easily answered, and ongoing debate reflects the complexity of real-world application. The future of behavioral economics will almost certainly be shaped by these debates. As the field matures, it is moving beyond the confines of laboratory experiments and isolated interventions. Interventions are increasingly embedded in adaptive systems, dynamic feedback loops that respond to changing environments and individual behaviors. This evolution is sparking new discussions about the appropriate boundaries of behavioral influence, the need for robust research methods, and the importance of integrating diverse perspectives into policy design. The national academies have called for strengthening research methodology and incorporating behavioral specialists into the policy-making process, recognizing that the promise of behavioral economics depends on both scientific rigor and ethical integrity. At the same time, the field faces challenges. Meta-analyses suggest that the effectiveness of nudges may be more limited than initially believed, especially when applied to complex social problems. This has led some scholars to advocate for a more cautious approach, one that emphasizes careful evaluation, transparency, and respect for individual autonomy. The ethical questions are not going away. As behavioral economics becomes an integral part of public policy and business strategy, practitioners must grapple with the consequences of their interventions, both positive and negative. The interplay between behavioral economics and society is still unfolding. On one hand, the field offers powerful tools for addressing inefficiencies in healthcare, improving financial security, and promoting social welfare, often at low cost. On the other, it demands an ongoing commitment to ethical reflection, transparency, and respect for the complexity of human choice. The promise of behavioral economics lies not in its ability to provide simple answers, but in its capacity to illuminate the subtle ways in which context, psychology, and design shape our lives, and in its willingness to ask hard questions about what it means to nudge, to choose, and to decide. As research methods improve and ethical standards evolve, behavioral economics is poised to remain at the forefront of the conversation about how to build a society that is not only more efficient, but also more just and humane.